One of the most prevalent myths about history that people the world over hold to is the idea that traditional marriage is between one man and one woman, and that it's always been that way. In the U.S. Supreme Court case Obergefell v. Hodges, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote a dissenting opinion which was joined by Justices Scalia and Thomas. In this opinion, he and his fellow justices show just how historically ignorant they are. Roberts' opinion states that the long history of marriage as an institution has been between one man and one woman, quoting Blackstone, Locke, and even Noah Webster as defining marriage in that way. And while he agreed with the majority that some aspects of marriage have changed over time, what he claimed did not change was the core structure of marriage as a union between a man and a woman. Well, sorry, John, Antonin, and Clarence, but you are all embarrassingly ignorant, and admittedly so. During an exchange with Mary Bonato, one of the lawyers arguing for the plaintiffs who are in favor of same-sex marriage, Justice Antonin Scalia said, "But I don't know of any. Do you know of any society prior to the Netherlands in 2001 that permitted same-sex marriage?" Yes, thank you for revealing how historically ignorant you are. And yet we're unfortunately in such a position of power. The reality is, most things that your typical person today thinks of as traditional usually dates no earlier than the 18th century. For instance, the typical wedding that everyone thinks of is styled specifically after the wedding of Queen Victoria, with those iconic Wagner and Mendelssohn songs, the tiered cake, the white dress, and everything. This is typical. Monarchs make stylistic choices, dress a certain way, or arrange a ceremony a certain way, and then it becomes all the craze. This happened with the popularity of wigs as the result of King Louis XIV. And the traditional notion of women working in domestic duties while their husbands work quote-unquote real jobs outside the home is something that only started to arise after the 16th century and the rise of Protestantism. Prior to that, women in the Middle Ages used to run businesses, own property, and even run local governments in some cases, especially such as an abbess who would have governed church lands and the community that lived off of them. Firstly, marriage isn't even original to human animals, but is rather a societal convention that developed after ideas like property and exchange were developed. Marriage was originally, and for the longest time, the process of exchanging people for political and economic functions. It was much like slavery. Women, for example, were viewed as a means to production of children, who themselves were viewed as labor and heirs to a family name or clan. Monogamy is also not a universal of marriages around the world or at all times, as polygamy was prevalent in certain regions. Even the Hebrew Bible exhibits a nonchalance with polygamy, as the patriarchs are said to have had multiple wives. For much of history and throughout many different cultures, marriage was essentially a father selling his daughter to a man in exchange for cooperation between the two families. This is why, to this day, we have the custom of the father of the bride walking her down the aisle. He's symbolically transferring ownership of his property to the groom, and his arm is wrapped around her because she's in his grasp, in his possession until he lets her go, when she is then taken in hand by the groom. In some societies, such as Greco-Roman, the dowry was a payment that the groom would make to the father of the bride, and in other societies, such as Germanic tribes, the father of the bride would pay the groom the dowry in order to facilitate the success of the new household. Weddings in the Middle Ages were originally a very private matter for most regular people. It was done in secret, and you made a bond with someone that had to be mutual and not forced by others. This is what the church encouraged. If people said they were married, then there was no reason for society to disbelieve them. Eventually, though, especially in the case of nobles and monarchs, it became increasingly necessary to verify the union as a legitimate marriage. This is because so many marriages were brought into dispute. To remedy this, there would be a ceremony before the public and officiated by the church to make it legitimate before God, and then the newly wedded couple would make their way to the bedchamber where they would engage in coitus, observed by state officials to make certain the marriage was consummated. This was known as the bedding ceremony. Same-sex unions did exist in the ancient world, in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Mesopotamia, in some regions of China such as Fujian province, and at certain times in ancient European history. Same-sex marital practices and rituals were recognized more so in Mesopotamia than in ancient Egypt. The Almanac of Incantations, for example, contained prayers favoring on an equal basis the love of a man for a woman and of a man for a man. In his early writings, Plato said that same-sex lovers were far more blessed than ordinary mortals. He even gave them a head start in the great race toward heaven, their mutual love refeathering their wings, although in his later writings he seemed to contradict himself, feeling that homosexual intercourse was deviant in like manner with incest. Ancient Greece is known for its custom of pederasty, a socially acknowledged romantic relationship between an older male and a younger male, usually in his teens. This relationship was typified by a mentor-pupil dynamic similar to an apprenticeship. In Sparta, the agoge was a rigorous education and training program mandated for all male Spartan citizens, with the exception of the firstborn son in the ruling houses. At around age 12, a boy would often enter into an institutionalized relationship with a young adult male Spartan, which continued as he became a paidiskos. According to Plutarch, the main purpose of the agoge was for Spartan boys to undergo intense physical trials in order to prepare their bodies for the harshness of war. The competitive nature of athletic events encouraged hard work and merit. However, it is likely that the agoge had a second purpose, to instill in young children a collective Spartan identity. The Roman Emperor Hadrian famously had a strong emotional and sexual relationship with Antinous of Bithynia. Sadly, his lover died prematurely, but was deified on Hadrian's orders. After Hadrian proclaimed Antinous to be a deity, he announced that a city should be built on the site of his death in commemoration of him, to be called Antinopolis. The deification of human beings was not uncommon in the classical world. However, the public and formal divinization of humans was reserved for the emperor and members of the imperial family. Thus, Hadrian's decision to declare Antinous a god and create a formal cult devoted to him was highly unusual, and he did so without the permission of the Senate. Although in general the Romans regarded marriage as a male-female union for the purpose of producing children, in the early imperial period some male couples were celebrating traditional marriage rites in the presence of friends. Ancient Roman men with power and wealth could marry same-sex partners, says Elizabeth Abbott, author of A History of Marriage. Emperor Elagabalus married Zoticus, a famous male athlete, and referred to his slave, a man named Hierocles, as his husband. Both Martial and Juvenal, Roman poets, refer to marriage between males as something that occurs not infrequently, although they disapprove of it. As the empire was becoming Christianized in the 4th century, legal prohibitions against marriage between males began to appear. But as Cicero might argue regarding rules and exceptions, the newly Christian Roman state would not have made legal pronouncements against it if it weren't witnessed as being practiced. In the southern Chinese province of Guangdong, during the Ming Dynasty period, females would bind themselves in contracts to younger females in elaborate ceremonies. Males also entered similar arrangements. This type of arrangement was also similar in ancient European history. According to ancient sources, the Celts were quite open to and embraced homosexuality and same-sex unions. The first mention of homoeroticism in ancient Celtic cultures is from the middle of the 4th century BC, in the Politica of Aristotle. In the second book, he points out that among the Celts, unlike among other warrior peoples, erotic love between men is accepted, and that love between men is held in high regard. Diodoro wrote of the Celts in Gallia, quote, "Although they have very beautiful women, they took little care of them. Men are much more fond of their own sex." We have further evidence from ancient India. Quoting from the article, "Indian culture does recognize homosexuality, let us count the ways," by Sanjana Ray of thequint.com, Amara das Wilhelm's book, Tritiya Prakriti, People of the Third Sex, compiles years of extensive research of Sanskrit texts from medieval and ancient India, and proves that homosexuals and the third gender were not only in existence in Indian society back then, but that these identities were also widely accepted. Citing from the chapter Purushayita in the Kama Sutra, a 2nd century ancient Indian Hindu text, the book mentions that lesbians were called swarinis. These women often married other women and raised children together. They were also readily accepted both within the third gender community and ordinary society. Varuna and Mitra, famously referred to as the same-sex couple in ancient Indian scripture of the Rig Veda, were often depicted riding a shark or crocodile or sitting side by side on a golden chariot together. According to the Bhagavata Purana, Varuna and Mitra also had children. Varuna fathered his first son when his semen fell upon a termite mound. They also had 2 other sons, Agastya and Vasistha, who were born from water pots after Mitra and Varuna discharged their semen in the presence of Urvasi. In ancient Japan, there was a defined role for a group of people in society called the nanshoku, meaning literally male colors, but better defined as homoeroticists. This was typically found in monastic circles and was considered a very devout and spiritual way of life. Nanshoku was not considered incompatible with heterosexuality. Both parties in a nanshoku relationship were encouraged to treat the relationship seriously and conduct the affair honorably, and the older partner in the relationship, often fulfilling the senpai or instructor role, might be required to write a formal vow of fidelity. In addition, there was no religious opposition from the rest of Japanese society against these homosexual unions. Tokugawa commentators felt free to illustrate kami engaging in anal sex with each other, and during this period some of the Shinto gods, especially Hachiman, Myoshin, Shinmei, and Tenjin, came to be seen as guardian deities of nanshoku. In contrast to the norms in religious circles, in the warrior samurai class, it was customary for a boy in the wakashu age category to undergo training in the martial arts by apprenticing to a more experienced adult man. According to Furukawa, the relationship was based on the model of a typically older ninja paired with a typically older chigo. The man was permitted, if the boy agreed, to take the boy as his lover until he came of age. This relationship often formalized in a brotherhood contract, and it was expected to be exclusive, with both partners swearing to take no other male lovers. As we can see, social conventions and what qualifies as an acceptable partnership or romantic relationship between people not only changed over time, but they were diverse even in one region and period. The definition of marriage was not everywhere or always considered strictly heterosexual or monogamous. Overall, same-sex relationships were much more normative in human history than homophobic and historically illiterate people give it credit for. Some of these historical examples were pederastic in nature, but others weren't. The notion that only heterosexual relationships are normative or acceptable, or that marriage can only be between one man and one woman, is simply not an absolute monolithic custom across cultures and eras in time. The traditional portrait of society from history is one of diversity and change.